presentation mode. It always kind of, all right, there we go. You all see it all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, as I was just saying, my name is Megan White, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Bat Conservation International. And I in charge of kind of two projects. One is gardening for bats. So I'm so glad that you all contacted me and have me here to present tonight. And the other is um, the Bat Ambassador Program, which is all about training people how to do bat walks in their local communities. So people learn how to lead the nature walk at night and teach people about bats as they go along the nature walk. So the crux of my job is kind of like we were just talking about, connecting bats and people. And that's kind of how I came to BCI too, is I came through a very roundabout way. I've always, from a very young age, been very interested in the combination of like how the environment and humans interact. And I think probably all of us who are listening to this would say humans are part of the environment, of course. But like how those like cross sections work has always been fascinating to me. My mom was an urban forester for Fairfax County, actually, so kind of near where you all are from. And I grew up going to tree plantings and riparian restorations and planting native species gardens and rain gardens and all of that good sort of stuff. And then my dad was someone who was just kind of interested in everything and had a background in psychology and ecology and horticulture and all of that. So these two things came together in me as well. And I was actually interested in the arts and writing and how those things fit into the environment, and got my bachelor's at George Mason with a special program called New Century College, and had a self-designed major in art, environment, and community, and then went on to get a master's of fine arts in environmental writing, and went from there to teach environmental literature and environmental humanities, environmental writing, that sort of stuff, and then moved on to museums and worked at the Library of Congress for about 9 years. And was really focused on community engagement, community outreach, ran the tour program and the volunteer program and that sort of work, and decided I wanted to get back into conservation and found this wonderful world of bat conservation. Um, and it really combines, especially gardening. I think of gardens as an art form and certainly a creative outlet that directly impacts and interacts with the environment. And so I feel like I have finally landed in the place where my original major was geared. So I'm so happy to be here. Um, let's see. So, Bat Conservation International, the organization that I'm working for, has a very simple mission, which is just to end bat extinctions worldwide. Just that. So it's an ambitious goal, but we work hard on it. The organization was founded in 1982 by Merlin Tuttle. We were talking about the founder a little bit right before the presentation. He has this phenomenal personality, and he was very involved or very interested in getting people to understand and love bats. He started as an ecologist and was doing research. He was a passionate photographer and photographed bats and really got some of the best early photographs that we have of bats. When you think about photographing a bat, you're photographing an animal at night that is moving, that's tiny. It's a huge challenge. And so his photographs really help to like unlock the world of bats for ordinary people. And really for a lot of scientists too, because often we're kind of studying things that we don't even get to see. We're listening for them as much as looking for them. So it's been great to see all of his photographs. So he was doing bat ecology, and then in Austin, Texas, there was a construction project with the Congress Avenue Bridge. And as a result of that project, there were these like slats that were underneath the bridge, and about 1.5 million bats moved in underneath that bridge. And so people were understandably a little bit freaked out. I think if you get 1.5 million of anything together, let alone bats, it gets a little dicey. So he saw this as a challenge and an opportunity. And so he wanted to use this in order to teach people about bats and to try to save the bats because they were on the line. The community at the time just wanted to exterminate them, really saw them as a pest. And through his efforts and the early efforts of Bat Conservation International, he succeeded. And so now um, Austin really thinks of itself as like a bat city. People there love bats in the same way that people in DC take real ownership of our pandas. Um, so maybe even more so than that, really. And the bridge has become a huge tourist destination. I was just looking on Google Maps actually before the presentation, and the bridge itself gets a 4.6 rating on Google Maps just for the ability to see the bats. So um, it was a place and a project that transformed bats from something slightly terrifying to something very exciting. And it is exciting to see 1.5 million bats all emerge. They emerge in kind of like a giant tornado. We call it a bat-nado, from bridges and caves, and they all emerge together every night. And it's really an incredible phenomenon to see. So I hope you all get to see something like that at some point. So since then, BCI has expanded incredibly. So we are now a truly international organization, and we have people working in countries all over the world. Um, we have a few key focuses. So we focus on endangered species interventions. So really trying to protect the bats that have the most need and that are at the most threat. But we also work with all kinds of bats. But that's one of our projects. We also work to protect and restore bat habitats, and that's all over the world and here in the US. We do a lot of that in the Southwest, especially with mines that have been abandoned and with urbanization and habitat encroachment, all sorts of things like that. We're there working to protect the bats. We also do a lot of scientific research, and our team is on the forefront of bat research and bat science. And then there's my department where we do outreach and education. And actually, everyone across the organization does a lot of this. So, a lot of the people who work for the organization have this same spirit that Merlin Tuttle had to start with, which is to help people learn about bats, to be a little bit less scared of them, and to eventually, hopefully, be a little bit passionate about protecting them. So I have some pictures here. I won't go through all of them, but just to give you an idea of the range of work that the organization does, down in the lower left-hand corner, you have one of our subterranean specialists who is fully geared up. I think it might just be cut out of the presentation, but he has an oxygen tank on and everything, and is going into a culvert in a area that is known for uranium mining. So he's fully protected and just like going in to learn about the bats that are in that area. So we've got all the way from underground to up in the top corner here, this is one of our scientists working in India, up in the mountains in a very remote area. And it's good for wind. And the wind movement actually has an impact on bats, which we'll talk about later. So they're doing research to learn about the impact of wind turbines and bats there in the mountains in India. And then we've got everything in between. So that's a little bit about our organization. So I want to start the bulk of this presentation with bat misconceptions, just like get these things out of the way right from the start. Um, so uh, I think a lot of people start, for me anyway, before I started working with BCI, I thought of bats as something like almost kind of magical to see from a distance. But if they got too close to me, I get a little bit freaked out. Not too much, and they almost never get that close. But everyone has a little bit of concern, I think. So I'll get into some of those concerns and see if I can alleviate them. And this picture is something that, like, it's from a movie. And I think now that one of my streaming services knows that I am interested in bats, and it's always showing me this, like, horror movie about bats. It's the worst. So we'll start there. So I think a lot of people equate bats with vampires. And even if they don't think that bats actually turn into vampires or vampires turn into bats or what have you, I think a lot of people do think that vampire or that bats will suck your blood. So there are three species, just three out of 1,500 species of bats in the world. There are only three that are vampire bats. And they don't live anywhere near us. They live in Central and South America, and they're not coming towards us anytime soon. So you can alleviate that from your fears to begin with. But even if they did live near us, they really wouldn't be a threat to us. So first of all, they are just not that into humans. They don't. They prefer animals that are standing still or laying down. So they do eat blood, and in fact, that's their sole diet, which is strange and wacky, right? Like, how do they even survive only on blood? That's kind of one of the mysteries of these bats that we're trying to understand. But they don't like attack an animal and like sink their teeth into it and like cling on or anything like that. So what they do is they have these very tiny, sharp, sharp, sharp teeth. And they make a teeny tiny incision, like you could barely even see this. And in their saliva, they have an anticoagulant that makes the blood flow more smoothly, and then they just lap up the blood. And that's all that happens. The animal won't even know that this happened. The biggest threat to the animals is potentially getting rabies through this process. They're not going to like pass out from their blood being drained or anything like that. And I'll get to rabies in a second. So the vampire bats really are just not a threat to us or to any humans, really. And in fact, the anticoagulant in their saliva is something that scientists are studying because it has a lot of potential to help with strokes and heart attacks and things like that. A lot of things that might be somewhat scary about bats are actually helpful to human health in terms of scientific research. Vampire bats are also super social. There is an experiment that happened kind of recently where they separated a bat from its like friend group. So they make friends, they have close-knit families. They separated the bat. No harm came to the bat or anything like that. They were just separated for a little bit. And as soon as they would let the bats that were separated back together with their families, the families and even friends would come up and be so excited and literally hug them. So these are like super social, cuddly creatures. So moving on from vampires. Like I mentioned, rabies is another big concern that people have when they think about bats. Um, Bats they do carry rabies, so that is a concern, but less than 1% of the entire population of bats has rabies, or that's the estimate anyway, which is about the same percentage as any other mammal. So the fact of the matter is mammals carry rabies. So you're actually in this area much, much more likely to get rabies from a raccoon, a skunk, or a fox than from a bat. And part of that is, again, bats are flying, they're out at night when we're not generally out as much, and they're not trying to have anything to do with humans. So it's just extremely, extremely unlikely that you would get rabies from a bat. Um, that being said, just like legally, I should tell you that if you've been bitten by a bat or any of these animals, you should definitely go and get a rabies shot right away. So that's something you want to treat immediately. But I do not think any of us will have that problem. And this kind of explains further why I don't think that we would ever have that problem with rabies, with getting bit by a bat. So another fear that people had, and this was my number one fear about bats before I started working with Bat Conservation International, is that they will get stuck in your hair. So I have a lot of hair. It's generally long, as I flip it behind my shoulders. Um, and I thought that it would be possible for a bat to just accidentally get in my hair, not intentionally, but maybe it would just like swoop by and like I've got a lot of it. Um, but again, bats are just not intentionally trying to come near humans, and actually, their echolocation is so fine-tuned that they can perceive things the width of a single human hair. And so, even though when they fly, they might seem like really erratic, their flight is erratic to us because they're perceiving the world through different mechanisms. So, for them, they're actually very aware of everything that is around them and able to maneuver around. So even if a bat is coming quite close to you for one reason or another, it's not going to get in your hair. It will move around. Then there's one other thing, and this kind of goes along with the rabies and the other fears, is that bats are flying rats. And actually, evolutionarily, bats and rats separated a long, long, long time ago. And so bats are actually more closely related to bears, horses, and even whales, if you can believe it, which are mammals, than they are to rats. And in fact, they are more closely related to humans than they are to rats. So we think that bats probably evolved from some creature that was more like a flying squirrel, like actual flying squirrels, than any kind of rat. Um, so that's kind of more of a fun fact than anything. The big difference really between bats and rats is all sorts of things, but one of them is that rats repopulate really, really quickly. They have lots of babies constantly, and bats tend to have one pup a year. So they just don't repopulate like rats do. Okay, so those are all the scary things. We're done with the scary things, and hopefully that has alleviated any fears you have about bats. If you have other fears, I'm happy to try to address them after the presentation. So I'm going to tell you a few fun things about bat biology, things that are just kind of unique to bats. First is they are incredibly diverse. So like I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are about 1,500, well, there are actually exactly 1,500 species of bats. We just found the 1,500th one this fall. We're kind of constantly finding a new species of bat. And they are hugely diverse. So you have the bumblebee bat here on the left. It is about an inch long. and it weighs about 2 ounces, so about the same weight as two paper clips. And then on the right here, we have the giant golden crowned flying fox. And that one is like the size of a small child. It only lives on, I think, one island. So again, this is not a creature you have to be concerned about, but its wingspan is over 5 feet long. So it's just like an incredible animal. So you have these very diverse animals responding to really very diverse climates and ecosystems. And bats live all over the world. They live from Alaska and Labrador all the way down to the tip of Chile and everywhere in between. The one place that they don't live is Antarctica. And that's mainly due to lack of insects. So they do need insects to eat, all of them except for those vampire bats. So, bat wings, these are some things that all bats have in common. So, all bats do have wings, and their wings are kind of interesting. Um, the Latin word for bat is chiroptera, and that means hand wing. So, bats are actually flying with their hands more than their arms, like birds do. So, you can see here that the arm component is mainly the same as humans, but the bulk of the wing is actually made from their fingers. So bats are really kind of flying like this and doing an immense amount of strategic maneuvering with their fingers, which I think is very cool. And they also have thumbs right at the tip of the top of their wing. And they use those just like we do for all sorts of things, sometimes for extra grip, sometimes to move things, all sorts of things. So yeah, hand flying bats. They also have really unique feet. So people wonder, how do bats hang upside down for such an extended period of time? And their feet are actually naturally in a kind of clenched position, and they have to use their muscles to open them up. And so when they're hanging, they're really not exerting very much energy at all, and it's really about the same amount of energy as we use laying down in bed. So this is actually a very relaxing pose for them. Bat knees are also funky, so their entire legs somehow along the evolutionary process actually turned backwards. So their knees move backwards in the opposite way from ours. And how insectivorous bats, so bats that eat insects, use them is they actually use their tails, and which includes their knees, to scoop up the insects, and then they will like bend down into like their tails to which they're using like a net, and then they'll bend down to eat the bug that they have caught. And you can just kind of barely make that out in this sequence of photographs. Which again, it's incredibly difficult to photograph these guys. So I'm glad we have at least this kind of representation. And then the last thing I'll talk about here is bat moms because they are amazing, like all moms, but bat moms in particular um, are just like phenomenal. So some species of bats are solitary roosters and they raise their pups alone and roost in trees, and they're like awesome single mom bats. And then there are other bats that have these huge maternal colonies where it could be hundreds of thousands, millions of bats all living together, and the moms will all roost together. The pups will stay in the cave while the moms go out to hunt, and they're actually born without any fur, so they have to huddle together. So they're all like cuddled together to stay warm. So when you see a bunch of bats all just like clumped together, that's what they're doing. They're just snuggling together to stay warm. Um, but Depending on the species, they can be incredibly social. So, some species of bats, if a pup is abandoned for one reason or another, something happens to the mom, what have you, um, the aunt or even a friend will then adopt that pup, which is very interesting. And some species will even like help each other give birth and even teach each other how to nurse, which is rare in the animal kingdom. So it's sometimes that's rare even in the human kingdom. Um, so um, they're pretty incredible in that way. And the most incredible thing I think about bat moms is that some of them migrate and will migrate hundreds, sometimes even up to 1,000 miles with their pup hanging on to them. And I just cannot even imagine like flying on the edge of storms generally, with your pup hanging on to you, and increasing your body weight that much. It's pretty incredible. So I wanted to share with you just a few bat species that are here in our area so that you can see how cute they are, or I think they are cute anyway. This is the silver-haired bat. It has silver just along the edges of its fur. Sometimes its fur is really curly, almost like a poodle's hair. You can see it has a huge range. This is a rare bat, but I detected one in my neighborhood. I'm actually here in DC, in actually. So I got to detect one of these ones, and you can see they have the long bat ears. So that's the Townsend's big-eared bat. And we have these of that bat that lives here in Virginia. And this is my personal favorite, the hoary bat. It gets that name because it has this kind of frosted fur, like hoarfrost. So that's where it gets the name. And I just think it's adorable. It's basically a flying little fluff bomb. So, yeah, that guy most likely lives in your backyard. So, a few things about bat ecology. So, getting a little bit closer to the world of gardens now. Um, I want to tell you a few things about how bats interact with the environment and what they do for humans, because they actually do a lot for humans. So, number one, I think a lot of people know this one, bats eat insects. They eat all kinds of things. A lot of bats in this area, their favorite is moths. And they will eat all sorts of other things too, though. So they'll eat beetles. They will eat ants, which is kind of wild. They'll eat caterpillars, like all sorts of things. But they love a good hardy moth. They're expending a lot of energy to get those insects, so the chunkier ones are the better payoff for them. Um, and so they're eating these insects from our backyards, which is great for us. So for a backyard garden, from that perspective, bats basically, if you give them the chance, can be your natural pesticide. And they do work in that way in agricultural systems already. So bats will go to farms and they eat an immense amount of insects, and it's really like unaccounted for economically. So we've done some research, and scientists estimated that bats save US farmers $23 billion. That's a billion with a B annually in pest control and reduced crop damage. And on a global scale, they think that number bumps up to between 54 billion and $1 trillion dollars. And this really, again, all goes unaccounted for. We think how this is working is that bats are eating the insects that are attacking the crops until the pesticide is sprayed. And then once that pesticide is sprayed, well, there are no more insects, so they'll move on to somewhere else. So this is a huge factor just economically and in terms of food security for humans. Bats are also pollinators. So all of the bats that are here on the East Coast are insectivorous, but in the Southwest and Southern California, and certainly around the tropics, a lot of bats are pollinators. They eat fruit, they drink nectar. So again, this gets into the diversity of bats. And they are incredibly important in pollinating all sorts of things that we love. So if you think of like a luxury good, it is most likely pollinated by a bat. So macadamia nuts, chocolate, the cacao that goes into chocolate, mangoes, and basically all of our tropical fruits, coconut, bananas, dates, um, coffee. There's actually a very special kind of coffee, and I believe this came from Madagascar. And the bats were going after the ripest berries and coffee berries before they were, processed and whatnot. And at first, the farmers were very annoyed with this, like they were taking the prime crop. But something was happening with their saliva when they bit the berries. They would usually only eat um, part of each one, and this would start a fermentation process, and that changed the quality of the coffee. And apparently, people just love this coffee, and it was actually selling for $200 a pound. So a great economic boon there from bats. And then the last one I have highlighted here is tequila, which comes from the agave plant, which is solely pollinated by bats. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And then for me, this is honestly the biggest one. So bats will reforest the rainforest. So especially these fruit-eating bats, they will eat, they're eating the fruit. They're often consuming the seeds, and then they will drop the seeds, just like they go to the bathroom, as they're flying. And they are one of the only animals that will go across a clear-cut area of the rainforest. And that's whether it's a smaller area, like a traditional slash and burn agricultural site, or a larger deforestation area, like you're seeing on the left-hand picture there. Um, and basically, without bats, these areas would not have the seeds, especially these larger areas, to regenerate. Um, Humans have tried to go in and regenerate the rainforest, but it's never as successful. Partially, they're just not getting the randomness and the diversity that bats just do naturally for free. And like I said, they're the animal that does this. So essentially, humans breathe because bats are there to reforest the rainforest. So they're incredibly important keystone animals, really. So I'll just go over a couple threats to bats, and then we'll get to the garden portion. So we're working, like I said at the start of the presentation, with bats all over the world. So the threats to bats will be determined by where they are, but there are a few things that are kind of happening more or less worldwide that I'll focus on. This one is a little bit more local to us. So this is um, really focused on North America. And you might have heard of this, white nose syndrome. And this is having a huge impact on North American bats and definitely on our bats here on the East Coast. So, white nose syndrome is a fungus that then causes a disease. So, it's possible for the bat to get the fungus and not get the disease. And we're finding that is happening more as the fungus spreads into the western half of the US. But on the eastern half, it has been completely decimating. So most of the bats here that get the fungus are getting the disease. Um, how it affects the bats is it creates these kind of like sores on their wings, and this irritates them and causes them to wake up during hibernation. And every time they wake up, they expend a huge amount of energy. And basically, they're just burning through their fat reserves for the winter incredibly quickly and not making it to spring. So, really, what's happening is they're starving to death. So our science team is working very diligently on this issue. We have a vaccine that we're hopeful can do some good. And so, of course, you can't really go in and trap and vaccinate every bat out there. So they're looking at how to distribute this. So one way is having that they do with other vaccines for bats is they have a gel that they'll put on the fur, and because bats are so social and groom each other, it then spreads, the vaccine will spread through the colony through their grooming techniques. There's also some probiotics that they're working on that they can put into the caves, and it doesn't impact, they've done a huge amount of research to make sure that it doesn't impact other cave life. Including all the little insects and microbes that are in the caves. But it seems to help the bats be able to withstand white nose syndrome. And there's some other ideas that are in the process too. And I'll talk about fat bat a little bit once we get to gardening too. So your gardens can actually help with white nose syndrome a little bit. So just to give you an idea of how catastrophic this is, just in a short amount of time, this disease came to or developed in the early 2000s. And in that time, tricolored bats have their populations have gone down 93%. Little brown bats, which used to be the most common in this area, have gone down 98%. So if you feel like you're seeing fewer bats than you used to, that's an accurate observation, and this is the main reason why. And then northern long-eared bats, their population in the US and Canada has gone down 100%. So I think that they have some populations in other areas, but in terms of here, they have been hit incredibly hard. So another big factor is climate change. And just to make this a more tangible thing, because climate change is impacting so many creatures, including us humans. I'll talk about the lesser long-nosed bat and the agave and the tequila that I mentioned earlier. So this is an incredible bat that has a very long migration track. They migrate from southern Mexico up to southern Arizona, Texas, and a little bit of California every year. So they migrate back and forth. And in order to do that migration, they need two things. One is agave, which creates a kind of nectar corridor. So if you've heard of a wildlife corridor to help animals, get across highways and that sort of thing, this is a nectar corridor that helps the lesser long-nosed bat get from Mexico all the way up to Arizona. So they need those agave, and the agave need them. So these bats are one of the few things that pollinates these agave. And then they're also reliant on storms. So these bats will catch the edge of storm fronts as they're blowing through and ride those storm fronts up along their migration route. And so these two things need to co-occur. So the storms need to be happening at the same time that the agave is blooming. And what's happening with climate change is the agave are blooming at different times than usual, and the storms are also happening at different times than usual. So this network, this pollinator corridor, is becoming unbraided. So that's a kind of example of how climate change can impact bats. There are lots of other impacts as well, but that's just one example. Like I mentioned with tequila, that is having a further impact. So when you make tequila from agave, the best thing to do is to actually cut the flower off before it becomes a full flower, and that keeps the sugars concentrated in the lower part of the plant. And so we're losing those natural wild agave corridors outside of climate change due to like farming practices and large scale agave farms taking over these areas that had wild agave. So our science and conservation teams work closely with the farmers in Mexico and are creating a new bat corridor that's specifically created by the farmers. And in fact, you can now get bat-friendly certified tequila. So look out for that if you're in the need. And then windmills. So I just talked about how climate change is impacting bats. And so, of course, we are supportive of windmills and renewable energy, but windmills are having an impact on bats, and especially um, some of the bats that have longer migrations. So my favorite that I mentioned before, the hoary bat, is having a huge problem with windmills. It actually has a migration route where they go north before they even go south, and then they take the scenic route like everywhere, which is something that I love about them. They just go all over the place. So their migration route ends up being hundreds of miles, close to 1,000 miles long. And it's just in that process, they're covering a lot of ground and they're going to run into windmills. The thing that we've found is that for some reason, and we truly do not understand this, bats are most impacted by windmills when they're moving, or wind turbines when they're moving incredibly slowly. Like they're always kind of moving slowly to the human eye, but when they're moving at the slowest speeds, for some reason, that's when the bats are most impacted. And so we're working with um, the wind companies to see if they will actually do something called curtailment, which is to shut off the wind turbines when they're going below a certain speed. That would mean they're losing a small amount of profit, but it's thousands of bats every year that are losing their lives. So we're working on that. And then the last threat that I'll talk about, because it leads into bat gardens, is habitat loss. So this is happening everywhere, all over the world. I've recently been working with a group of scientists down in Florida near Miami to work on a plant list for bat gardens, specifically for the Florida bonneted bat. The Florida bonneted bat would naturally live in the Everglades and Big Cypress, that area. And what is happening, this is kind of an extreme picture, really, but the picture up in the upper right-hand corner shows what is happening with development. And so these bats are just really getting pushed out. So our team developed a special bat box for the Florida bonneted bat. They're larger than usual bats. My coworker Melky says they're big boys and they need big boxes. Um, and we have started working with the local community throughout Miami and the surrounding areas to put up these boxes. And they're all throughout the city. They're on golf courses, they're in parks, they're at the zoo, they're in just straight up urban areas. And the bats are using them. So that is really like the best case scenario for bat boxes is when the habitat is going away to create an alternative habitat. So it's not the ideal solution, but it is helping. Um, so habitat loss is happening here in this area too. I'm sure you all have noticed that every time a house gets bought, it is almost certainly plowed down. Every single tree is plowed down, and then a big giant house goes up and takes up the entire lot. And that is actually having an impact on the bats in this area. So we can help with that and with some of these other issues through our gardens. Um, so I'm going to talk about food, shelter, water, light, and a few of the wider benefits for creating a garden that is beneficial for bats. And these gardens are exciting for me because they're a fun, creative, tangible action that you can actually take to help support bats. And it helps with that habitat encroachment. So, if houses on your street are getting plowed down and all the trees are getting taken down, your yard can kind of become a sanctuary. And if you team up with your neighbors and kind of create a corridor of bat-friendly gardens, that can really help them a lot. So when this becomes an exponential thing that's happening in your community, that's where things get really good. So they help with that. And then, like I mentioned with white nose syndrome, the more native insects that we have to help our bats bulk up before they go into hibernation, the more we can be helping them on that front as well. Um, and then, of course, the more native species that we're planting and the more trees we're planting, that can all have an outsized impact on the wider ecosystem and the local climate. Planting trees in the city can actually lower the temperature by 10 degrees. So it's a good and actual useful way to have an impact. So, if you would like to create a bat garden, you want to think about food. And when you think about food for our bats here on the East Coast, we're thinking about native insects. So, we want to plant plants that are attracting the insects that bats will eat. So, in that case, we're really talking about planting native plants to attract native insects to feed our native bats. So, that's the real crux of the matter. That and reducing or eliminating your pesticide use so that those insects can survive. And then the bats will be the natural check on those insects. So when you're thinking about, well, what kind of plants would be good for bats? You want to think about plants that host moths or that are food for moths. So that's the number one way to think about it. Some flowers bloom in the day and at night, and some only bloom at night, some only bloom in the day. So, flowers that bloom at night are particularly beneficial because that's when the moths are out and when the bats are out. So, we're thinking about a nocturnal ecosystem, essentially. And that's another reason why trees can be great. You don't think about trees having flowers necessarily, but they do, and they tend to be open at night. Light colored flowers can be really beneficial. The moonlight just bounces off of them and they attract insects more than other flowers. But really, like any color is fine. But if you have some white ones or some lighter colored ones, that might draw the insects to the rest of your bat buffet that you're creating in your yard. And then both bats and moths and other insects love a good fragrant flower too. So like the stinkier, the better for these guys. Um, so those are some good like general rules of thumb. These are some keystone plants that are good for bats and for the entire ecosystem. I took these off of Doug Ptolemy's website. He and his team have put together a great database. We're in the process of working on our own plant lists and databases specifically for bats, but in the meantime, he has a really great one that focuses specifically on keystone plants. So these are the plants that are doing outsized good. There are tons and tons of native plants that you could choose to put in your garden that would be beneficial to bats and to the entire ecosystem. But these are a few that are really doing way above their norm for the whole ecosystem. So late boneset, that also smells amazing for humans and for bats. Any kind of goldenrod is going to be a good bet. Brown-eyed Susans, black-eyed Susans, orange coneflowers, basically any kind of native coneflower is going to be a great option. Evening primrose, of course, that's fun for kids too. I have very fond memories of going out as a kid and watching the primroses bloom. Um, And then asters, any kind of aster, native aster to this area will be great. And aster is a good example of a flower that has been highly cultivated. So cultivars are generally not going to be as beneficial as your like truly straight native varieties. So that's the best option. Um, so you're just going to get the most interaction between the plant, the insect, and the bat when you're going with native plants, and especially plants that are native to your particular ecoregion. And then trees are hugely beneficial, like I've been hinting at. So they attract all kinds of bugs and moths, generally without being annoying to us humans who don't necessarily want to be swarmed by moths. So this is going to keep them up in the branches of the trees generally, and they also provide roosting sites, and they are great for all sorts of other organisms as well as bats. Oak trees are your best bet. Oak trees are doing outsized good for the entire ecosystem. So white oak is like if you could plant one tree, plant a white oak, but any kind of oak is going to be great. Shagbark hickories are another really good option. That loose bark creates all kinds of nice crevices for bats that are tree roosting bats to nestle up into and have a nice, cozy place to stay. Red maples or any kind of maple are a good option. River birch, I think, are just beautiful, and they also have that nice, curly, textured bark that can create a great roosting spot for bats. And then any kind of pine that's native to this area is also going to be a great bet. Oaks and pines are probably doing the highest overall benefit for the ecosystem in terms of tree choices that are great for bats and other creatures. So once you're starting about to think about what flowers and shrubs and trees you might want in your back garden, one thing to really think about is year-round blooms. And I'm sure you all are thinking about this anyway, but especially when you're thinking about wildlife gardening and gardening for bats, um, the earlier and the later you can have those blooms, the better. So those early blooms are really going to help attract the insects for the bats when they come out of hibernation or when they arrive from migration. So having like Virginia bluebells would be a great option for an early spring plant. And milkweed, of course, I'm sure we all know the benefits of milkweed. They are great for monarchs, absolutely necessary for monarchs, but they are also great for bats and all sorts of other animals as well. Goldenrod are a great option for the fall. They go late into the fall, depending on what variety you're looking at. And personally, I think they can be a great replacement for mums. So they give you that nice pop of color. Like to me, they have that sense of like just like summer nostalgia and like that late fall kind of like, like aged 60s photograph kind of feel. It just like has this wonderful nostalgia while giving you the color in the fall. And then in the winter, even though your bats will be hibernating or have migrated, your garden can still be doing lots of good and be beautiful for you. So I think winterberry is a great option to keep your garden interesting for yourself and for all of the creatures in it in the winter. So for bats, especially having these vertical layers in your garden, if you have the space, can be really beneficial. So I've gone on about trees, but having a tree can be really helpful. And even if you can't have a large oak tree, which a lot of us can't, that's completely understandable. If you can have a smaller native tree, that can be really beneficial as well. So you just want to create some layers, and what that does is it creates um, the like little niches for all sorts of life and all sorts of insects that actually will be living at different levels of the ecosystem, so different levels of plants here. So if you were only to plant low-lying flowers, then that's going to just like limit the diversity of insects that are coming to your yard. So that's thinking about food. So now I want to talk a little bit about shelter. Um, so I talked briefly about bat houses earlier. A lot of people, that's our number one question is people asking us where to buy a bat house and how to make a bat house, that sort of thing. And our answer is really plant a garden. So bat houses are great for certain circumstances. If you're dealing with habitat encroachment, like I was talking about in Miami, to a certain extent, even here, bat houses can be a great option if there's just no other better option available. And they can also be great if you're dealing with bats that have somehow gotten into your home. So if you have bats in your attic, or sometimes they'll get into like older homes or older buildings. In the UK, they deal with bats in churches a lot. Um, and so having a bat house nearby can help lure those bats out of your home, and then you can seal up the entryway that they're using once they're out rather than keeping them in. And then they have a nice home to be in. So those are good use cases for a bat house. But in general, a tree is almost always going to be the better bat house. So planting that tree is really going to help. You can see on the far right, you can just make out the little furry body of a bat that is taking shelter inside the curled leaf there. So that's an example of how bats are likely there, even though you aren't seeing them. So, end of story, plant an oak. All right. One more thing here. Snags are really great for the whole ecosystem and especially bats. They make great homes for bats and for all these creatures that you can see on the left-hand photo. A tree, sometimes people think about trees as having lives in like thirds. So a third of their life is spent growing, a third of their life is spent sustaining itself, and then a third of its life is actually spent dying and decaying. And in that third of their life, they are actually, while they might be appearing dead, they are creating an immense amount of life. So here in the suburbs of DC, everything is compact. You can't always keep a snag in your yard because it's a risk to your house and your neighbor's house and whatnot. But you can advocate for them being kept at local parks. And if it's, not a danger, it can be helpful in your yard. I actually have someone down the street who had a tree that died and they cut it off maybe like 4 feet from the ground or so and left the lower branches. And then in the summer, they actually hang potted plants from the lower branches, and it's actually really attractive and fun. So you can get creative with it too. So we've got food, we've got shelter. Water is our last basic need. Bats are kind of funky with the water. So they drink while flying. You can see the bat here on the left, his adorable little tongue is stuck out while he's about to sip up a drink of water. Bats actually need about 7 to 10 feet of water in order to do this. So a lot of backyards are just not going to have that option. So luckily we have lots of rivers and ponds and things like that near us, and bats will most likely be getting their drinking water from there. If you have the space and the resources and the capability, having a small native pond in your yard can do an outsized amount of good for bats and for, again, all sorts of animals in the ecosystem. And I know I'm probably running a little bit short on time, so I'll skip going into much detail about ponds. But one thing that you can do if you don't have a lot of space and don't want to get into pond life, which is fine, just putting a simple saucer of water out can really help. And bats aren't going to be drinking from that, but those insects that bats are eating, they need to drink too. And so putting a couple of stones in a saucer of water like this can really help them out. And then one key tip is you want these insects to be able to drink and survive long enough for our bats to go ahead and eat them. But you don't necessarily want to be breeding mosquitoes in your backyard. So just like filter or change that water every couple of days, and that will prevent that completely. And the bats, of course, will do their bit in eating the mosquitoes and all the other bugs. Of course, that's the whole name of the game here. But there is a balance. You want to be able to enjoy your yard as well. So you want to attract the bugs without having swarms of mosquitoes, particularly. And then the last factor that I want to talk about is light. So bats and really the entire nocturnal ecosystem are really impacted by street lights and all sorts of other artificial lights. So one thing that you can do is if you have a light outside that you have any control over, obviously we don't have a lot of control over the street lights, but if you have uh, the light shield or the cone that's going over the light, if that is angled so that the light is all going down instead of up and around, that does so much good for bats and for the insects that they need to eat, and for all the other nocturnal animals as well. Another thing you can do is make sure you have a light bulb that is a warmer tone. So those like really bright white lights, they are really hard for insects and for bats. It throws off their whole circadian rhythm. And it can be really blinding for a lot of the creatures that are out at night. So if you go with a warmer color bulb, that can be a huge help. And then having a timer can also help. And I am sure, speaking with that timer, that I am about at time. So,
You are, Megan, and we have
yeah.
a lot of really good questions in the chat, and I wanted to
Okay, great.
get to
Then
those.
I will just, I'm gonna skip over and we'll just end there. So
Okay.
great.
Uh, Thank you so much. I'm going to start at the beginning, and people were talking about their experiences in Austin, um, and and the issue of the attic. And there were some questions about white nose syndrome, and I think you probably answered most of those. But one question that I think you didn't answer was if crop pesticides negatively impact bats. I know you said that the bats come in and eat the insects before, before the pesticides take effect,
Right.
those systemics. But if they were to eat the insects that had encountered an insecticide with the bat, how would that affect the bats?
That's something that we're researching right now. So my gut instinct is that it's probably not great for bats. I can't imagine it's good for anything to be consuming something that was sprayed specifically to kill it, you know. But the scientific answer is we just don't actually know quite yet. Um, so that's what I can say.
Okay, thank you. And then Pat had also heard that there was some evidence of natural immunity to white nose syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some bats do have natural immunity, which is amazing. So even some of the bats on the East Coast seem to have survived and they're continuing to survive. And so we're researching those bats to try to figure out how they survived and how we can further support them. With lowered populations, it's harder for bats to survive at all since most of them are, so social.
Hmm.
Um, so, and then on the western half of the country, it seems like a lot more are surviving and seem to have some form of immunity. And so we're looking at that really closely because if we can figure out why they're surviving, then maybe we can keep this in check before it spreads further around the world. So,
Yeah. Okay. Um, and a related question is, does BT affect bats?
BT.
Uh,
Um,
like I believe that's what's in um, the mosquito dunks.
oh, yes. I would say the same answer as the other pesticides. One of the on Doug Ptolemy's website again, they have a great mosquito bucket challenge, which is an alternative way to get rid of bats and just for not to get rid of bats, excuse me, to get rid of mosquitoes. Um, what they have found is that the sprays that most people are using on their lawns in terms of mosquitoes are really not very effective at all. So getting in bats and other creatures, actually dragonflies are really good at eating mosquitoes. So getting in a wild deterrent is going to be a better option. And then those mosquito buckets.
Carol Edwards asks if one said, mentions one successful conservation strategy of some animals has been to construct over or underground road crossings for the animals. Is there any consideration of a similar strategy for bats where a route through a windmill farm would be constructed to help the bats migrate safely?
Because the windmills are so dispersed and so large, I don't know if anyone has tried that strategy specifically with windmills, but they have with other areas that bats need to move across. They have created kind of like artificial tree systems. So bats will often follow tree lines through cities. And so where they can't plant trees or where they won't grow fast enough or to get across large highways, certain bats, like the bats with that I was talking about that are reforesting the rainforest, they don't mind going across big swaths of open space. But other bats don't want to cross necessarily even like large highways. So they're creating these kind of artificial forests to help train the bats to go over. And that's another way that your gardens can really help is creating these corridors through the cities, especially if you're able to like work with your neighbors and friends to create corridors going from park to park so that bats can get to these kind of oases in the city.
Okay, great, thank you. Chris asked, what do bats that live in the dried tree leaves that you showed in that beautiful slide, what do they do during the winter? It's very exposed. So where do they go? What do they do?
I believe that one was an eastern red bat. And they just hang out in the trees and they will be in leaves. Sometimes they will be in bark and they have thicker fur than other bats. So you'll see like the really like floofy, fluffy bats that I showed you that are native to this area. They will have that thicker fur than bats that are living in like a desert, for example. And then the eastern red bat, excuse me, is unusual because when it gets really cold, like on a night like tonight, it might actually drop down from the tree and burrow under the leaf litter. And that will give it that little extra bit of insulation to get through the night. So yeah, it's a good idea not to go walking through the forest off the trail too much in the winter. You could accidentally step on an eastern red bat.
Do they prefer pine or leaves, or do they have a preference?
I'm not 100% sure, but I know that they do. The ones that I know about have tended to be in like hardwood trees. So I'm not sure if they roost in pines. Hoary bats will roost in pines. Those are great roosting options.
Yeah, okay. And then several questions about particular plants. Are red hot pokers, Nyphophia, a good bat nectar plant since they look similar to agaves and have tubular flowers?
I'm not, I don't know specifically about that one, but that does make sense. The red tubular flowers do tend to be great options. Even though, like I mentioned, that's like a great example of an example that isn't white, that isn't getting that moonlight, but can still be a great option for the ecosystem. So,
Are any trees good nectar sources for bats? Perhaps catalpa trees?
in this area, there aren't any bats that are feeding on nectar. So the nectar tr trees are going to be more like in the southwest and or in tropical areas.
Okay. Um, Pat mentioned that Doug Tallamy recommends motion detection activated lights. What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, 100%. Um, I was getting there with the timer. So having a timer or a motion sensor activated light, if you can swing it and make that happen, it's a great idea. Yeah.
If they're flying around at night, aren't they tripping it constantly? Bats?
Um, I think it depends on how sensitive the sensor is, and also, um, I've never, so my parents have a light sensor, or a motion sensor, excuse me, on their lights. And I've never seen that tripped by a bat. I know that they have bats in their yard, so I'm guessing maybe they're too fast or too small to trip the sensor. But it's, yeah, definitely not going to be strobing your light, that's for sure.
Okay. um, and are any of the bats in this region fruit feeding bats? And would putting out hanging fruit be good for them? Watermelon, citrus, bananas, something like that?
Yeah, no, our bats are purely insectivorous, so that won't help the bats, but it could help other animals. So it's not an all-around bad idea, that's for sure.
What is the latest advice about using bat guano as fertilizer?
So bat guano, you want to make sure that it is sustainably harvested, and that it's um, harvested in the best way. So, what's happening is in some areas of the world, people are going in and like really disturbing the roosts, and going in at the wrong time of the year, the wrong time of the day, etc. And it's actually having quite an impact. So again, there are like certifications for sustainably harvest guano, sustainably harvested guano. There we go. Um, so you want to look for that.
Okay. What about the ultrasonic pest repellers that make that sonic sound?
That's a good question. I do not know about that. So I'll look into that though. That's really interesting.
Okay. Um, and then Carol Allen wants us to all know that BT has no impact on mammals, reptiles, or amphibians.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's something I don't have a lot of expertise on, so that's great.
Well, I want to thank you very much. There are many thanks in the chat, which I'll share with you afterwards. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming to the Four Seasons Garden Club for our monthly program. Really appreciate it and hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being here and for having an interest in bats at all, let alone like taking your evening to learn about bats and gardens. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank